Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig. Would like to once again say hello to my colleague and friend John Tamney. John, how are you?
I'm great. Great to be back.
Great. Well, we're here, of course, in the nation's capital and talking about things all regarding the intersection of business and politics. We're within the midst of another hearing on Capitol Hill where we see the state of play between big tech in America and big government, some would say. Another hearing involving the CEOs of big tech, once again dragged up before Congress, talking about the state of play, potential ramifications of, some would say, censorship, others would say the appropriateness of government regulation. But we're talking about the broad issue of, what is the role and what is the place, if anything, that the federal government has to play in the world of big tech today. The lead, of course, is presently the latest and greatest from the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where we have three of the big tech titans in front of the committee getting a grilling. So, John, why don't you start us off with some of your thoughts in terms of this really hot and ongoing topic about what, if any, role the government should have when we're talking about the regulation of big tech in America?
Well, what it brought to mind is, I don't know if you remember 2002 and 2003. I don't remember which failed first, but we had WorldCom and Enron fail within 9 months of each other.
Right.
What's important about this is that these were major companies that died, but the markets hardly moved. There's about 3% decline, but relatively it was quiet. Then Sarbanes-Oxley happened as a response to these failures. Suddenly, we criminalized the reporting of bad data. So basically, CEOs were forced to become accountants rather than innovators. And stocks cratered based on this because it was going to hamstring the future of innovators to be innovators. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about this because at the time, Cisco and some of the big names of technology loved Sarbanes-Oxley. For them, they already had the legal types and the accountants in place. Mm-hmm. This was a barrier to entry for those that would be the next Ciscos. And I thought about this as Mark Zuckerberg saying, each company should have a legal team to make sure that what's being posted is not fake news and different.
Right.
Facebook would love that because it's got that in place. It's the businesses that might replace Facebook, and yes, eventually Facebook will be replaced.
The smaller, more modestly funded businesses.
Yes, the future does not have that kind of legal team in place, and so it really puts the new entrants at a disadvantage.
So I love the Starbucks comparative. That is a really creative and insightful reflection. So what you're saying, and I think that there's a lot of COOs and CFOs that would agree with you big time, the Starbucks mountainous burdens of being able to look into the records and have that comparison and that confirmation and signing off on that involves such a large bureaucratic overlay of corporate expenses that it's something that inherently is going to be holding back small business in America, because how are they going to be able to have the resources versus the big guys that are going to be able to, unhappily but successfully plow through that? Is that the thought?
Oh, without question. Yeah. Is it any surprise that IPOs declined a great deal after 2003?
Right.
Suddenly it became very expensive to IPO, and so more and more of them were sold to big technology companies. That's an important thing, distinguishing factor there. But also, can we point out the obvious that the only businesses that know they're not dominant are big tech? They're the only ones that know. They're spending tens of billions a year investing in smaller businesses, buying them, because they know their days at the top are numbered. And so any kind of regulation like this is what they would love to have happen, because
right.
it does make it more difficult for the entrants to come in and wipe them out.
So the crushing effect of yet more regulation from the regulators would be able to be more headwind for the competitors, for the Facebooks and the Googles of the world.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's interesting.
Let's say that you and I discover tomorrow a cure for pancreatic cancer. Can we bring it to market?
In a few decades, no problem.
The question answers itself.
Right.
But if we team up with Bristol Myers or with one of the big pharmas, we could get it to market relatively quickly.
Right.
And it was another revelation in my time in Washington that I always thought that the FDA was looked on negatively by them because they delay the introduction of new drugs. Oh, no. The established big pharma companies, we're talking about someone who loves, and I love big business, they like the existence of the FDA because it ensures that any new innovative discoveries basically have to go through them if they want to get to market.
You know, one of the many things that I find so interesting about this topic, and there's just so many fascinating aspects of this, is that one could argue, and I believe that this is very applicable to a significant extent, this issue and what's being discussed in front of this committee and the Senate committees and everybody that continues to obliviate on television when they have their moment in front of the camera, it's really not about regulation of competition. Certainly, it has unintended or perhaps indirectly intended consequences of a competitive nature, such as what you're pointing out, which is very interesting. But one of the main issues that Congress is wrestling with, and that I think that we as a business community and as a country are wrestling with, isn't so much an issue of competition, but it's really an issue of content. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of toxic poison that's flowing through the pipes of the internet today. And, you know, we have the First Amendment, and the government can come in and Bigfoot that. And obviously, any kind of censorship is bad. The problem is that you have so much toxicity that's flowing through with fake news and a lot of harmful information. You can point to specific phenomena, and we could argue about these things all day. There was at least some kind of an indirect impact and effect as it related to feeding the frenzy that flowed into the death and destruction of January 6th. Even putting that aside, as they're discussing in the hearing in front of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, there's a lot of fake information about coronavirus and about what people can do to be able to save lives. And one of the problems is that when you have a for-profit model, which I'm 110% behind, can you really rely on Mark Zuckerberg to be a good corporate citizen and make sure that they do the right thing to not get fake information out that can literally cause damage and cause loss of life? And that's one of the issues that's being debated in what's known as the so-called Section 230 reform conversation. And it really sounds like a very dry topic, but it's kind of a big deal. It's the part of the internet law that absolves and waves a magic wand of non-liability for big tech for things that are said or moderated on their platforms. And there, as we'll talk about in a moment, there's some real changes afoot that's going to be a really big deal in tech. But do you see any behavioral issues with regard to how people like Mark Zuckerberg are maybe fundamentally incapable of handling some aspect of their business that has a direct impact on you and me and people throughout the country?
I don't worry about it. And I guess my answer is, if we're worried about fake news or the inflow of things like that, that just calls for more free speech, not less, for the opportunity for others to say, you know, what's coming out on Facebook is so slanted, or it is because of the algorithms, because of how you get certain forms of news based on how slowly you scroll, we have a better way of getting it to you. And so I think the answer is not more regulation. I know some would want that, because the more regulation means it's more difficult for people to come in. If there's suddenly going to be a liability for someone getting on the internet and saying something for the portal that just is set up for you to say it,
right?
Well, that works well for Facebook. It does not work well for the new entrant that might have a new way of getting information to you.
Absolutely, and that goes back to your point on Starbucks. In terms of how this talk on Capitol Hill, which frankly has just been kind of a three-ring circus, is actually turning into actual potential legislation. Senators Klobuchar and Warner have drafted legislation that's going to potentially change Section 230, which is the immunity law, to say, look, we're going to start with a very narrow and reasonable approach. We're not here as legislators to, for lack of a better phrase, engage in broad censorship. We don't want to break up companies. We don't want to censor companies. However, there have been specific personal harms that have been perpetrated because there have been falsehoods through social media that have resulted in scams where people have lost a ton of money, have resulted in hate speech and threats, which has resulted in people getting assaulted and sometimes killed. So the thought by the senators is to create a bill that will just shave down a part of Section 230 as it only relates to a platform's failure to timely respond to takedown requests on things that would cause personal harm to people. If something is carved in a very specific, targeted way, how would you feel about something like that?
I would say it's wholly superfluous for the reasons we just discussed. Facebook has an incentive to filter out the bad or the fake, simply because it doesn't want to be known as a place, a cesspool for information, for bad information. I say they all do. And I say this as someone who thinks that even if you got rid of Section 230, so many people from my world say, well, Section 230 protects big tech. I don't buy that. I think even without it, it would be very hard for people to file lawsuits against Facebook saying, well, this person said something awful about me on Facebook and it wasn't true. Well, yeah,
right.
They said it. Facebook didn't say it. And so this idea that somehow this immunity thing from 1996 made Twitter and Facebook possible, I don't take that seriously. Why isn't MySpace still here? Why isn't Friendster still here? These aren't the first, Well,
you're certainly not the first or the last person to take that view, and obviously I totally respect it. But I can tell you that as a total blanket shield of immunity, these kinds of laws, specifically Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, has had some pretty profound impacts. It's interesting. I can even just talk from my own personal experience. I had a crazy guy, I won't say his name, but he was crazy, was a defendant in a case that I represented a client, and he was upset that we won. So he went to one of these internet billboards and literally posted that I was in conspiracies with judges and then with senators and just all this crazy stuff, accusing something that it was like tinfoil hat stuff. So obviously you knew that it was crazy. And we demanded a takedown, and of course he wouldn't do it. So we went to court, and we also included the internet company, and all the company did is they just said Communications Decency Act, Section 230, and there was absolutely nothing that they were required to do, despite the fact that the things that were up there were so fake and so fraudulent. Now, I don't mean to put myself in the center of the conversation. That was years ago, and it didn't really have any effect on me because the claims were preposterous. But there are people out there that are really hoping on the goodwill of Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg to try to clean up the pipes. And the problem is that unless they have a specific, direct economic incentive to do it, it's just going to be a bunch of gibberish and happy talk. The other thing that makes it so disappointing is that even though there's some legislation on Capitol Hill, just by looking at the hearings that have been going on, it's just a political three-ring circus, and you just have all of these speeches, and they reach out and they haul these guys back, and then they sit them in front. Well, they're not really. Well, I guess they're in chairs, but they're really sitting in front of a screen. Maybe that'll change in the fall, and it's just a bunch of political theater. Have you ever seen a hearing on Capitol Hill lead to specifically productive legislation for something that was directly related to the business market? Can you think of an instance?
No, of course not. But we know that because any kind of intervention, I think that markets the best regulation.
Right.
And I think you hit on something that's important. There is a lot of gibberish and happy talk on the internet. There's a lot of nuance, wrong and right on it. And it's just ultimately not that important. What was said about you, everyone knew was nuts. And so what's the incentive there to fix that? Now, if it becomes problematic, if people are losing their livelihoods over things, if businesses are actually losing their good brand name, you will see a big change in this, is my speculation. And we will see changes in those on top precisely. Let's never forget, I think there's this view right now that we are at the frontier of communications, that Facebook and Google and these other sources of information, this is it, that there's no future beyond this. That would be a naive presumption. Let's not forget that 20 years ago, eBay and Yahoo and AOL were the be-all and end-all of internet. It does not last, and I submit to you, I'll say it over and over again, that if I'm sitting in this chair 5 years from now, we will be talking about different tech-dominant firms.
Absolutely. I mean, you can select any industry, telecom, 5G, the dominance of Huawei, and then of course the government. What do? They're stepping in on Huawei and TikTok and trying to get their hands on and regulate that too. I'll just note that there have been not less than 3 big tech CEO hearings here in Washington within the last 6 months. The number of actual specific proposed pieces of legislation that actually came up for a vote here, 0. So here we go again. If you want to run a circus, come to Washington. If you want to actually get something done, go to a boardroom, or just start to think about where to invest your money. So where do you think, one of the things that I find interesting in this is that I also look at this, not a lot of people in Washington look at this as a regulatory opportunity, but I look at it as a business opportunity. Maybe there's an algorithm or some kind of a technology solution that can be interposed into this environment or this ecosystem that can help better flag fake news. Facebook said, and I really literally don't believe anything that comes out of Mark Zuckerberg's mouth, because I just think I just don't like him or believe what he says. But he claims that they have tens of thousands of people that are working in content oversight capacities at Facebook to try to manage this. But for a person who is so up on tech, you would think that there would be better algorithms or better technology to try to be able to help solve some of these problems that's going through these social media spaces.
Yeah, you'd think, or again, maybe the point of this is that there's really not that much demand for what Congress wants. And I keep going back to it. The fact that there have been 3 of these big hearings, and they always involve the same companies, that to me is a very potent market signal. If Washington has discovered you, that's the surest sign that your reign up top probably isn't for long. And it's not just because Washington's going to regulate you out of existence.
Right.
But success drives imitators. Success drives copious amounts of investment in what will replace. Silicon Valley is a monument to replacement. That's why it's so rich. Most businesses fail there, but also it's a monument to constant change. Just as there are no sacred cows in Las Vegas, they tear down the old and replace it with the new. That's what happens in Silicon Valley, and I think it's a safe bet that precisely because Washington's focus is on Facebook and Twitter and these different ones, soon enough, we are going to discover different companies that have innovated around them.
Well, technology is amazing, and American business is very entrepreneurial, and there are things that change all the time. But it seems like really the more things change in Washington, the more they stay the same. You and I were here a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about GameStop. And everybody was talking about, GameStop, shorts, roaring kitty. Remember that? And everybody was losing their minds, and everybody was, really having a very hot debate. What changed? Absolutely nothing. And, we end up in the same cycle. There is going to be a role for limited government, but at this point, with all of what's going on right now, there seems to be a very limited space for any relevance for Capitol Hill right now. Certainly, there are some things that they can do. I know that you and I have some disagreements on COVID relief spending. You have a very interesting argument that every dollar or every $1 trillion that's diverted towards one malady has been drawn away from curing something else. But what as we draw to a close here, what do you think are going to be the big issues on Capitol Hill this year? I mean, in terms of anything that might possibly get productively discussed and addressed from a legislative standpoint. We know that some of these guys some of these folks are a bunch of clowns, and it's a lot of political theater. But do you see anything meaningful happening on Capitol Hill this year from a legislative standpoint? And what's your prediction in terms of what lies ahead for 2021 in terms of any potential legislative priorities? Is there anything from a business standpoint that you think should be teed up there?
Well, if I knew, I'd be a billionaire. I mean, it's really that simple. If I had a clue which businesses and which regulations Capitol Hill was going to go for, if I knew which businesses they were going to try to muzzle or basically call to heel in the future, we could make a lot of money off that.
Right.
And that's the thing. Washington is always fighting yesterday's battle, almost as a rule. And so my strong sense is there will be more of this because they're in the news. Washington is constrained by the known. It doesn't speak ill of them. It just speaks, it's just me being a realist. If the politicians had a sense of the unknown or what the future was, they wouldn't be on Capitol Hill. They'd be making exponentially more money as investors. And so they will continue to try to bring into line the known. Meanwhile, the real innovators, some of which work for companies that probably don't even exist yet, are going to slowly innovate around what is known in ways that we never imagined. And we will once again say, wow, that wasn't the frontier. And we'll be talking about other dominant tech firms that cause us to say, oh, well, maybe this is the frontier. And they won't be.
Yeah, and maybe most of the answers lie outside of Washington. Imagine that. I predict that there will be meaningful legislation that is going to be a specific, tangible change to Section 230. It's going to be the first change of that law in about a quarter of a century. The current bill by Senators Klobuchar and Warner will ultimately, in substantially the way that it's being drafted right now, I predict will pass this year, and it's going to be relatively narrow and specific, but it is going to fundamentally change the way we digest the stream of news in America. John, always a pleasure to see you, and look forward to chatting with you next time.
Absolutely.